very much. Thanks for coming along. I understand you paid to listen to me, so I feel like I have to put on the show here. This painting is called Monkey Painting, and this was shortlisted for the VP Portrait Award back in 2005, and it's sort of see, I'm getting a bit long in the tooth now, so it's an older painting. But I've been starting my artist talks with it for years, and I suppose partly because it's one of those images which crystallizes something for me, and I suppose it raises the question with the gorilla and the person, the gorilla holding the photograph or holding the camera. It's sort of why paint a picture when any monkey can take a photograph. This it's not intended as a disrespect for photographers or anything like that, but it's the issue is why do we do what we do, and particularly in relation to the technological world that we live in, because painting is essentially primitive. It's very much old tech. You're taking mud and sticks with hairs on the end and trying to do something with them. So the idea of the monkey painter is an old one, and there were a lot of paintings of monkeys painting, because the idea was that the monkey was nature's ape, and I've sort of adopted that persona myself in my own work. I think of myself as a monkey painter, a bit like this. And what I'm trying to do is, to some extent, be nature's ape, and also to acknowledge the sort of the atavistic aspect of painting. That it's almost like in today's sort of hyper-technological and mediated world, that it's almost like an act of resistance to that, in holding on to the notion of something so old, so traditional. Like, people have been making paintings for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. It goes right back to the Paleolithic, and who knows how long before that. So while I try to be faithful to nature, I think my work is also trying to be painterly, and this is sort of a close-up, and just maybe gives you an idea of the painterliness of my work, that I try to be spontaneous and direct in the work. Now, this is very sort of, you might say it's old masterish, in terms of its general aesthetic. It's very much looking back again to the old masters from Renaissance painting, and this is where I've come from as an artist. This was my first love, and this is again one of my relatively early work. This is a St. Jerome, and I've shown the study beside it, partly because I just have room on the side, but to show the sort of the process. And in a sense, it's a very traditional process. Doing the drawing, it's all laid out. I'm using sort of structures and sort of a little bit of sort of geometry underneath, and older notions of beauty, like the serpentine line, the spiral line that defined Renaissance sculpture and things like that. And it's of St. Jerome. And I studied in Italy, and I lived in an Irish convent. I was staying in the attic room of an Irish convent, which was called San Girolamo, St. Jerome, and there were pictures of St. Jerome all over the place. And because of my connection with the tradition, I thought it would be very natural, to paint a picture of St. Jerome and, so to speak, join that tradition. But this is something that I've come to question, I suppose, as an artist. Partly because of how people responded to it. And very few people today would have any idea who St. Jerome is, or have any serious connection to that tradition, because they don't really believe in that religion anymore. Here's another relatively early picture that I did. This is a flame of Marsyas, and again, it's very traditional in its concept. And you know, Titian painted flame of Marsyas, Raphael painted flame of Marsyas. These are common, traditional Renaissance humanist themes. And I thought, well, why don't I do that and sort of join that tradition? But when I did it, I was a little bit shocked at how people responded, particularly a lot of Irish people, and looked at this and thought, oh, it's another fucking crucifixion, you know? This is religion, this is all we're against, you know? There are a lot of people in Ireland who are sort of, you know, almost aggressively secular and against the religion, turn their back on that and the mythology, even though this is pagan, you know, even though this isn't Catholic or anything like that. The concepts and the ideas behind it are completely alien. And most people today would have no idea who Marsyas was or the story behind the myth that comes down through Ovid, or the sort of the philosophy that is sort of latent in the image. So I sort of came, you know, my question was, why paint, you know, gods that people don't believe in anymore, and you know, religion, you know, the icons of religion that people don't believe in anymore. I could justify it by tradition and by a notion of neoclassical painting, I suppose, but that didn't make any sense to me. So this is something that I self-consciously rejected at this point and moved on. So you'll see where that takes me, but this is just the sort of the starting point, I suppose. So in terms of my own process of salvage and retrieval of what I could take from the old traditions and what I also had to bring to them in terms of contemporary. Here are some of my, you know, my sources for one particular painting which I'll show. And the first thing is the painting at the top left there, which is by Gauguin and has this great title, which I put at the top. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? And I thought, these are very basic questions, and to me they're questions that any serious work of art sort of needs to answer at some level. So those were some of my, you know, my guiding questions. And I was also looking at, you know, Renaissance art works like the School of Athens, which is below it, you know, grand painting, really ambitious painting, like the Veronese and like Courbet's artist in his studio, pictures that tried to make a big statement. In the sort of the where do we come from, where are we going, I was thinking in terms of, you know, things like evolution, you know. So these are some of the modern ideas, the ideas from the last century or two that we have to sort of, you know, build into our philosophy and our sense of where we come from and where we're going, which weren't available in Renaissance. So the classic image of evolution in terms of walking primates sort of evolving as they walk and turn into humans, that was one of the images that I looked at. Another was the image at the top left here, which is an ape's limbs compared to a man's. And that sort of fascinated me because the right-hand square with the man with his arms extended, if you know your Renaissance history or your art history, that's Vitruvian Man. That's the image that Leonardo made famous. And the idea that human proportions have this perfection, you know, and that the perfection is demonstrated by the human fitting perfectly within a square with the arms outstretched. But the monkey doesn't fit, and you know, the monkey's legs are too short, so he ends up sort of dangling and looking sort of half crucified. And I thought that was a very interesting image. So all of these different sources came together in this painting, which sort of used the image of the ape and man compared to create a space and a sort of a quasi-religious space, I suppose, in terms of the lighting and whatever. But I don't know if you can see behind, evolution is occurring in the background from left to right. You know, you have this sort of walking evolution going on in the background, and then the future is veiled, it's covered by the curtain of the figure. And then I had this, you know, in terms of the mythology that I was using, I thought, well, this is sort of like a Last Judgment scene. This is time compressed. And it's like, you know, it's almost like the end of the world scene where we have to come, you know, look at the whole history of humanity and what it represents and what our relationship is to nature and to apes and everything else. And the figures in the foreground, there's a sort of a scientist weighing a monkey, and this sort of notion of weighing and measuring, you know, it harks back to the weighing of souls, you know. So it's sort of using scientific iconography, which sort of crosses over into religious iconography, to try to say something about, you know, where we've come from and where we're going. But also, there's an element of critique here and of irony, because our relationship with nature is obviously dysfunctional, you know, and the sort of the oddity here, the fact that the monkey is sort of, you know, looks crucified, and this is like a, you know, it's almost like a crucifixion scene, and you have on the far left there, you've got a gorilla embracing a keeper, and he seems to be crying, and there's another, you know, there's a little monkey covering his eyes, which literally came from one of those see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil images. So all of these things ended up getting thrown into this, and my daughter on the left is holding a sort of a banner which has the original text from the illustration that launched this image. And just give you an idea of scale, here's the painting. This was from my Enemies of Progress show in San Francisco. So this was a pretty large painting, not huge, but large enough to have impact. So here's another painting where I was essentially staying very close to the you know, my traditional roots in terms of Renaissance and Baroque and Old Master art, but trying to update subtly and trying to change the mythology. So this is sort of based on the Garden of Eden and the Adam and Eve mythology. But I thought, well, why don't I just play with it a bit? And the Adam and Eve story always struck me as very sort of depressing and negative, and this sort of attitude that knowledge was evil. You know, knowledge was what led to our downfall. And I've always thought that knowledge was, you know, there's a saying by of Nietzsche's, you know, where the tree of knowledge stands, there you will find paradise. And that was always my sense of what knowledge and learning represented. So I thought I would try to turn that around a little bit. And I'd also come across an image of people collecting, this is an Egyptian image, a fresco, an Egyptian mural of people collecting figs from a fig tree. And there were baboons in the fig tree that were actually, they were giving the figs to the people. They were trained to do this. But I thought it was a lovely image of sort of, you know, cohabitation with nature. And in Egyptian mythology, the baboon is Thoth, who's the god of wisdom. And I thought that was an interesting idea. So I thought of, you know, instead of the usual snake, that I put a baboon in the tree and have him handing the fig, which in in Mediterranean tradition, the fig is the tree is the fruit of the tree of knowledge. In the northern Europe it's the apple, but in Mediterranean countries it's usually shown as a fig. So the baboon is handing this sort of Eve figure a fig, and she's collecting. And on the other side, you have this male figure who's a hunter coming in and bringing the body of a deer. And I thought these could represent two different types of knowledge, essentially. That there's some knowledge which you have to receive. You know, you have to be just receptive to and receive it as a gift and be open to. But there's some knowledge that is hard won, and you have to go out and get it. You know, you have to go out and struggle to earn it, and it's bitter knowledge. It's bound up with pain and suffering and death. And those were sort of the two types of knowledge that I thought these are coming as sort of offerings to the child in the middle, and he's sitting and he's looking down at a book which has an image of human embryo. And human embryo at that stage, you know, at 4 weeks, it still has a tail. So it connects right back to the evolutionary notion. But the tail is also the symbol of the devil. You know, the human with the tail is demonic in our mythology. So I wanted the painting to have that, you know, to have a little to have a tail. So that's one of my paintings. Again, this is a project that I worked a long time on. This painting was basically 20 years in the making and went through various versions. And it was shown in the RHA a few years ago. Here it is in the Hamilton Gallery in Sligo. I show Experiments with Reality there last year, just to give you a sense of the scale of the picture. The figures are almost life-size. So not all my work is large. A lot of my work is small and tends to be based around still life, and very much tied in with observation. And this would be an example. This is my still life with judgment, and you can see the setup as I paint it and the painting itself. So you can see that I'm being essentially very, very true to observation, at the same time as being playful. You know, I change the color of the drape and stuff like that. But it is very strictly observed, and this is the sort of work where, because I've done so many of these, I really develop my skill level and my observational muscles, painting pictures like this. So here is a picture in full. This is called Still Life with Judgment. It's an allegory, essentially. The symbolism behind it is the weighing of souls. It's the Last Judgment and the weighing of souls, a bit like with my previous picture. But you know, this is what justifies the head on the weighing scales. But underneath the weighing scales are a set of books of art theory. So I'm playing with another metaphor here, which is of, you know, calculation, you know, judgment as, you know, rationality, calculation, all of these things, everything that lies behind the face in terms of, you know, it's like a model of the brain as something, as a calculating machine. And this is, you know, I'm trying to balance those sort of quite abstract notions where the head is sort of looking up and thinking in terms of ideal forms and being very critical, with the fruit at the bottom, which is intended to invoke pleasure and our sense of, you know, appetite, our physical appetite, our delight in colour and touch, and that I want these things to be tangible, you know, so it's like trompe l'oeil, like the the grapes are sort of tumbling over the plinth and almost into your space, so that you almost want to reach out and touch them. So those are some of the sort of dynamic tensions in this. And it's also a little bit like an altarpiece, you know. It's also the notion of the painting as an icon or an almost like a religious space in terms of its focus and concentration. Those are all also ideas that I've had. This is some of the sort of the you know, the architectural structure which underlies all of this, and it may look sort of intimidating, but it's basically the geometry rectangle, and it's basically, you know, that the dial of the weighing scales is smack bang in the middle of the picture. You know, it couldn't be simpler in a way. There's no, you know, while I use a certain amount of geometry, people go on about the golden section and all sorts of abstruse notions. There's none of that in this. It's fundamentally very simple, very easy to deploy. So another element of my still life exploration was vanitas. And vanitas appealed to me because it has so much baggage, essentially. Still life can be very much just about painting objects and taking pleasure in objects, but I tend to be, you know, I like to load my pictures with meaning and have symbolism and all sorts of things. And vanitas is just the treasure load of symbolism in still life painting. And it's all based around the idea, you know, the world's ending, you know, everything's gonna end, you know, either abandon hope, all ye who enter here, or else, you know, we drink, we merry, for tomorrow you die. But I thought I could, you know, maybe update the genre to take in modern apocalypticism, you know, our own sense of doom about the future. So this one's called It's the End of the World as We Know It. And I put the books on the left-hand side are real books, all written in the 90s. And you've got the end of nature, the end of science, the end of art, and the end of history. All quite, you know, famous and influential in their fields. And I thought, right, well, I'll stick those in. How about a deflated plastic globe skull, you know, and you know, almost like a, you know, an ironic commentary, the Picasso postcard, which is like, you know, it's almost like, you know, it's hysterical in terms of the tears that are sort of bursting out of her eyes and everything, and it's intended to be, you know, a little bit comic and a little bit serious in terms of, like, well, you know, how close to the end of the world are we with all of these ideas around us? But the end of the, you know, I chose the title because it's the title of a song as well, and whenever you hear that, you'll probably go, it's the end of the world. Everyone knows it, and everyone will possibly smile. So it just adds another element to the painting in terms of, you know, almost making it like a sort of a pop culture meme. This painting is called I'm Still Standing, yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, I've used a title which everyone will, I think, connect to, and they'll know the song, and it may make them smile. This is where, again, different elements of material started to come into my paintings, and the wooden blocks, the children's blocks. Guess what? I had kids, and all of their toys and things started to end up in my paintings. And this particular picture, I suppose the starting point was my son Daniel, who used to build these sort of amazing, incredible tower blocks out of these, you know, and they went up and up and up and up and up. And then when they went as high as he could possibly make them, he would kick the thing over and it would all collapse. And he did this, like, he got as much of a thrill about the whole thing collapsing as he did putting it up, you know? This kaboom as all the blocks went all over the place. But our, you know, cultural memory is, you know, you can't watch something like that. I certainly couldn't watch something like that without thinking of 9/11 and the big tower blocks coming down. So I thought of this as a sort of a metaphor or a simile for what was going on in the big world, and hence the plane flying across in the background, and you might wonder what it's you know, what it's doing or what it might be flying into, with the sort of the skyscraper scene in the background. But the message of I'm still standing, it's sort of a vanitas again. It's sort of, you know, I'm still standing for now. We all are, but we all know what we have to do with ultimately. So that was part of the idea behind this. Again, you know, my kids love dinosaurs and things like that. Started into my work. One of my kids he was mad into dinosaurs, and he had a book, and one of the illustrations in the book was a human skull beside one of these big, you know, T-Rex or like T-Rex, you know, things with teeth for scale. And I thought, wow, that might be an interesting still life. And I wanted to get one. You know, I wanted to see, can you get a T-Rex skull from somewhere? I was working in the Natural History Museum, actually. I did some work there, and I said, can you get me a T-Rex skull? And they were sort of like, we wish, you know, they don't have one. But what I was able to get was a quarter-size model from the Natural History Museum in London. So you can see that at the back there. And I rolled up a little ball of masking tape and put a little miniature paper hat on it, and then set a real human skull with a paper hat in front. And sort of, you know, I was still basically working from life on this and trying to match, but I blew the skull up to full size. And this was the sort of picture where I got some kudos from my kids, you know, once upon a time. But lots of people loved the dinosaurs and the T-Rex. So this is another sort of thing which, you know, all the potential, you know, children's toys started to come in, and I found it sort of fascinating because it's like the world of children's toys is like a miniature model of our whole world. You know, you can get everything reduced, and they're heuristic objects. They are intended. They're little models that children use to work out how the big world works. And I decided to sort of use them the same way in my paintings. So in this particular version, this is called Observations on Class Structure in the 21st Century. So the levels in the painting are they represent, you know, my notion of social class today. You know, class is something, I suppose it's sort of political and maybe controversial. Some people might think that we're in a classless society or we're aspiring to a classless society, but I think class is really alive and kicking. And as I constructed this, like at the top here, you have the Disney princesses and the Joker, and they are being shown a picture which is Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, which was, I think, might still be the most expensive picture ever sold at auction. So their world is the world of the super rich, you know, the billionaire, the 0.0001% class, you know, people who can buy a painting for hundreds of millions. And they're being showered with helicopter money, essentially, which is how, my view of how they got so rich over the last 2 decades, that basically the central banks, in trying to save the financial system, just printed money, and we didn't get it. It went to the top 1%, essentially. So beneath those, you have a bunch of superheroes, and they, to me, are the sort of the upper middle class, the righteous people who are invested in the system and see themselves as heroic and defenders of the system. But the system is sort of dysfunctional, and they're the screen has, which you can't see very well there, but there's a picture of the Joker, who's having the last laugh there. So they're sort of the powerful, the well-to-do, but they no longer sort of really control the system. And it always amazes me how these superhero figures, the Superman and Batman, even though in the mythology they're sort of all powerful, when you get them as little figures, the little figurines, they almost always look frustrated. It's like, they're always like, things are, it's like they're struggling, or they're angry. So I sort of, thought that this was interesting. So underneath this, you've got a bunch of cows being milked, and they're looking at a screen of green fields, and you may not be able to see it very well there, but they're being milked by Google. The milk truck at the back has a Google logo on it, and they represent basically us. We're sort of the client masses being milked for our data. And beneath that, you've got the angry people who we all know about, I suppose, this week in this country. The people who are really, really pissed, so pissed, they're prepared to just rock the system and possibly even take it down. They're what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables or whatever. The people who are just so pissed they don't care anymore. That was sort of my little picture of class structure. And here's a sort of a spin-off from that, which is called Animal Farm. And again, it's the notion of the masses being milked for their data. So this is us again to some extent, and you can see my setup underneath, where I've actually got the little cows and I got the screen and I got the whole thing. But while you could call this still life, it's actually it's evolved into something else. Like, these are almost like little fantasy stills or movie stills that don't necessarily completely reveal their origin. There's as much fantasy in these pictures in terms of the atmosphere and the space that I've enveloped the objects in, as there is, strict truth to the observation of what was in front of me. And this is another one, which again was sort of a spin-off. This is called The Storming of the Capitol, and it was done back in 21, and obviously that was when the Capitol was stormed. But it's this idea of sort of an eruption of the monstrous and the crazy and the uncontrollable into our political space. This one went off on tour. There was the Hamilton Gallery had an exhibition, Meditations in a Time of Civil War. They did a series of exhibitions themed around Yeats paintings, and obviously Meditations in a Time of Civil War is one of Yeats's poems. This picture went off to China, interestingly enough, on the tour, as well as America, and there the exhibition was called Ancestral Houses, which is one of the stanza in Yeats' poem. But they weren't going near the Civil War title. That was sort of, the Chinese were not going to go down that road. But it did show there. I thought it was interesting. While I've developed that side of still life painting, I've also doubled down in terms of a very sort of a fundamentalist notion of still life painting itself, traditional still life painting, what I call my bread and butter paintings. And quite literally bread and butter a lot of the time. They're my bread and butter in the very practical sense that these are paintings that I earn my living from and that are relatively easy to paint, relatively simple to paint for me, because you set them up and you paint them, and the complexity, the narrative and the thinking that goes into a lot of my other work is relaxed a little bit, and I go for something relatively pure and simple and calming, and this is obviously appreciated by our very anxious, world. So this is an element where I try to sort of, give an antidote to some of the bitter medicine of my other paintings. But there's also this notion I try to embody in these paintings. There's a phrase in Heidegger's philosophy where he talked about a sort of thinking that is also a sort of thanking. And I thought that was really nice. I wanted to do something like that, and paint pictures that are in a way statements of gratitude for simple pleasures, and also in some sense gifts. That I consider these pictures, even though they're you have to buy them obviously, but I love the idea of if I paint a packet of biscuits or a carton of milk or something like that, that someone might give one of these pictures as a gift and say, I brought you a packet of biscuits, here's a carton of milk, and that it has that sense of just presence in both in both senses of the word present, and down to this is a tiny little picture of a cupcake, and it looks very grand here, and you can maybe see with it blown up how much observation, how much concentration has gone into this, and it's almost like trying to find the universe, a galaxy in something small and tiny. But at the end of the day, this is just a tiny little picture of a cupcake, and I hope in its density and its simplicity that it carries something. But it's something that even if it's very small and very simple, it can take observation. It can take contemplation for a long time, because so much feeling and thought and concentration and observation has gone into it. So a lot of what I do starts off, I have notebooks where I sketch things out, and I try, insofar as possible, to just be true to very simple ideas that may come out of my head just as a simple image. And this is one of them. And this is literally the first sketch that came out of my notebook, and this is the painting it turned into. And it's called Speechless, and it plays on the idea of painting as mute poetry, which is an old idea. And here you've got an image of painting literally as mute poetry, and she's gagged, you can see. But this idea of what you can communicate purely through an image without saying anything. And this was something I was keen to explore. Obviously I talk a lot, and I talk a lot about my work, but my paintings ultimately have to stand on their own legs or in their own frame without anyone chattering away in front of them, and that it's, everything that I talk about with you here is actually in the painting. It is in there. And if you are, I think, visually receptive, my hope is that it will come out. So that was part of my idea. And here you can again see my setup with the model, where just like I was with the still life painting, I'm painting as directly as I can, and as spontaneously as I can. Here's a close-up. You can see, the work that this actually goes down fairly fast. These are paintings that are constructed in short bursts, of intense activity, and then I have to lay them aside. So a painting like that may take months to do from beginning to end, or years, but the actual time laying the paint on is actually quite short, and a lot of the rest is thinking and considering and preparing for the next, burst of frenzy. Here's another painting where, again, using the human form and working very directly from the model, but letting go imaginatively as well. In this case, I was thinking of figures representing the four elements, fire, earth, water, wind, and I ended up doing a lot of burning figures for whatever reason. I thought it was sort of an interesting metaphor that I somehow identified with in some way, the sort of sense of us, consuming ourselves, like it's, where people talk about being burnt out, and whatever, and I thought, well, I'm not burnt out, but I'm burning. This sense of being a flame in some sense fascinated me, and I did several images, and they sort of became more and more dynamic. So they started standing and then walking like this figure, and then they developed into running. And this is where some of my sort of forays into new technology occurred, where I wanted to have a figure running, but you can't paint a figure running, so it has to be posed. And then I found that you could use CGI technology to model a figure and light it and almost like set it alight in using computer-generated imagery. And that was something I began to explore as a sort of an addition to be able to help me visualize things that I found hard to visualize totally. Now the models, the 3D models of the humans are still relatively primitive. They're improving all the time. But this is one example. And then I back up with the model here, and you can see that's the foot, and I used, working directly from the model and using CGI to come up with this image of a burning woman. Then this is, you can see just, that's the picture in the back. I just thought I'd throw that in because this was from my last show in Berlin, and what a nice space to show paintings in. But a little bit bragging here about showing them. But that's just to give you an idea. So this is obviously Donald Trump. I painted this back in 2019 during his first presidency, and again, he didn't pose for me, so I had to try to invent. And I was invited to this show in California called The Illusionists, and it was a bit of a crossover show with fantasy art and illustrators. And some of the original, like Conan the Barbarian artists, like Boris Vallejo and people like that, were going to be in that show. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to have this crossover? But I had this image of Trump as a sort of an American Conan the Barbarian, you know, this this sort of almost literal barbarian who was, you know, laying waste to American democracy. And I thought, well, maybe I can do something. And the show was opening on the 31st of March in 2019. And I proposed at the time with the curator launching this painting on the 1st of April as Donald Trump's official portrait. So I was in California, and at midnight on 31st of March, 1st of April, in California, which was 8 a.m. Irish time, I tweeted, thrilled and honored to paint President Trump's official portrait, flying to Washington for the unveiling, and attached this image to it and sent it out. And then I had to go to bed, basically not knowing what would happen in the intervening hours until I woke up. But the Irish crowd, woke up to this, my Irish crowd, and it sort of, most people got the joke. Some people found it really funny. Some people thought, oh my God, Conor Walton's gone over to the dark side. They took it seriously. But it was, and luckily, I think it passed under Trump's radar. He didn't see it, but it caused a bit of a stir at the time. But it's essentially a sort of a play on American fascism and the destruction of the American empire and political order. So he's, Trump is holding the flag, but it's a tattered flag and it's been uprooted rather violently, as you can probably see, and all hell is breaking loose in the background, and there's stealth fighters flying overhead, and he's standing on a heap of skulls, and there you've got the fascist salutes coming in from the bottom left, and Melania is in her bondage gear. She actually owned this stuff. She was photographed in this stuff from her modeling career, so I took that directly. But I wanted to do a picture that would as I saw it, sort of dance along the cultural fault line in terms of being the sort of picture that people, Trump supporters and even Trump himself, they might actually like this. They might actually enjoy this because it's all macho and it's all, aggressive and sexist, and it's all, got its roots deep in American popular culture. This whole gung-ho, aggressive, muscle-bound tradition, and at the same time be a sort of a critique, a betrayal with a kiss. So this is a little bit of the process of how it was done. My source image, which was a Frank Frazetta, is of Conan the Barbarian. It's at the top left, and from that I sketched out my own version, and I started with just these muscle-bound superhero toys. But then I used the CGI technology to build more, and I downloaded a 3D Donald Trump head and lit it and stuck it on the CGI model and built up the thing that way, so that I could get a sort of a lighting on the figure that you couldn't possibly get from any sort of photo reference. So it would be sort of true, but highly constructed at the same time. And that became the centerpiece of my asymmetrical warfare show, which was in the Lewin Gallery, also in in 2019. So my notion of asymmetrical warfare is what I think, it's my model for being an artist in the modern world, sort of having to fight, because painters are committed to a very, very traditional art form and a low-tech art form in terms of actually making things by hand. I sort of think of it like fighting a war with bows and arrows, and that artists in our world are essentially like the Indians, being massacred by the cowboys. There is no longer, it's very hard to make art today that is really subversive or any threat to the establishment. Most art today is totally politically marginal, and no matter what I do, most of it will be ignored. I've attended a few representational art conferences, where you get you get people from all across the world. They're all artists, and they're all sort of, they have a notion of themselves as being, maybe subversive or challenging. But the one thing you're almost sure of is that there are no secret police in the audience. The CIA, the MI5, they are not going to be infiltrating any arts organization because we're irrelevant. We can do no damage to the system as it stands. But that sort of gives it freedom, because you can actually say what you like almost without danger. And that's interesting to me, just in terms of the space that art embodies today. There are really no taboos anymore. There is nothing that you can't do. There's nothing that you can't say. And my question really at this point is, how artists use this? Can they weaponize this? And this is something I've tried to explore a little bit. So here's Elon Musk, and I painted him basically on Mars, and there's a bit of mockery here. I painted this back in 2019, when Musk was much more popular than he is today. But I basically used the symbolism of the Salvator Mundi, which is the Savior of the world. The Leonardo image of Christ is the Savior of the world. In my world, he's the Antichrist. And that's my sense of who and what he is. So there is a level of mockery, but he's holding an upturned globe. It's a world, our world turned upside down and being destroyed in a sense. And I was fascinated by this notion of Musk as a savior, that he was going to save humanity by rescuing people and taking them to Mars. It's like he's working, constructing Noah's Ark for the day when the Earth is no longer inhabitable. And this sort of perverse notion of the savior is really out there. There are loads of Facebook groups of people who worship Musk, and they're literally called, Elon Musk the savior, and in Elon Musk we trust, and all of this. It's really religious, and they've got hundreds of thousands of followers. And when I did this picture, I joined all of these little Facebook groups, and then I popped the painting in when I did it, and it was sort of very funny. It even got taken up by the SpaceX social media people. They reposted, and initially it was like, oh, there's a lovely picture of Elon, and then some people sort of thought, but this is this is mockery. He's being painted as the Antichrist, and the sort of militant atheists among the science crowd really, they know their Christian iconography, and they saw that I was, mocking Musk, making him the Antichrist. So these big arguments sort of arose, which was quite interesting. So it doesn't necessarily go anywhere, but I thought it was interesting as a sort of a social commentary, and to see what you can do with sort of loading an image, almost like a bomb, to see what can you make the painting sort of explode in some way? Can you make it? Can you load it with something that makes it really challenging? So here's another image again, based on the Salvatore. That last one, by the way, I called it Salvatore Tuesday, because Tuesday is Mars Day, and Mars is the god of war, and I thought that was sort of relevant. But this one, this is the Madonna of the Future. Again, it's taking the Salvatore Mundi theme, but this is like Madonna holding this fetus in a vat, like in an artificial womb, and this is where we're going, I suppose. The scientists have actually developed now these artificial wombs, and they brought a baby lamb to term in a tank, essentially, and there's I suppose a question which is going to arise more and more as we get further and further from the basics of biology and reproduction, is that if you can sort of outsource human reproduction entirely, what does that mean for being a man and being a woman? And the notions, there's so many people now who choose not to have children, and sex for a lot of people is very, very detached from reproduction, and that allows for exploration of new gender identities and new ideas of what it means to be a man or be a woman, and I thought that might be interesting to explore in a painting. So I thought, of having basically a sort of a gender ambiguous Madonna who doesn't need a womb to have a baby, and used the androgyny of the elite Leonardo, because all of Leonardo's faces are essentially androgynous. They're designed to be on the boundary line between the masculine and the feminine, and to have this image which sort of really you wonder, what is this, and who am I in relation to this? So I thought these would be interesting questions to ask, because the old notion of the Virgin or the Madonna, it's very tied into a biological conception of our sex, and of the connection between being female, maternal, nurturing, all of these notions. And I thought it would be interesting to sort of challenge those and look at this this very modern situation going forward, which you sometimes encounter, when you meet someone, you think, is that a man or is it a woman? And that, ambiguity and questioning is more and more something that we need to explore. And I thought it was interesting to tie this back to the sort of the Renaissance notion of androgyny, and even Marcel Duchamp, where he did he put the moustache on the Mona Lisa, and at that moment, when you look at the Mona Lisa with the moustache on, you realize what an underlying sort of masculine structure the face has. So I thought all of that was interesting to explore. This is another of my recent paintings. This is The Second Coming. And when I painted this, because I had the show up in Sligo in the Hamilton Gallery, which did all these Yeats-themed exhibitions, I thought of this as, Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, which, has become so quotable and so relevant again to our life and our situation. But I sort of thought I'd do my version of it, thinking of, apocalypse in the Middle East and Gaza and everything else. And so the dinosaur and the jet fighters in the background are sort of a metaphor for all of that just chaos and death and destruction. And then this little Trump baby being worshipped by world leaders and gifted, in this blatant corruption, this absolutely, you couldn't have corruption on a greater scale than what's happening today. And then, just throwing in everything just because I can, I love the idea of painting as a space where essentially anything can happen, and where what works is whatever you can get away with. But in this world, the dinosaurs are back in some sense, and I wanted to have this. This is sort of a nativity scene where I used the classic statues from the crib to construct this, along with my frustrated superhero figures and the Joker. And instead of having the typical animals of the crib, the domesticated, docile, the cow and the donkey and the lamb, I have the pig and the fox and the snake and the dinosaur as, the symbols of the creatures that will be, drawn to this little monster. And here he is with his presidential seal, and there's the Joker. And I've ended up sort of identifying a little bit with the Joker. He's sort of, when I started off as the monkey painter and doing a certain amount of monkey business in my pictures, the one expression of that is my identification as the Joker, essentially. And here I am, this is my latest self-portrait, where I've put myself basically as the sort of the sad fool, the sad clown, with an Irish, tricolor fool hat, playing my identity while the apocalypse rains down behind, and trying to explore with humor, maybe trying to find what you can say through humor that you can't express any other way. And I was always fascinated by Lear's fool, in King Lear, by this this crazy speech that yet contains so much wisdom. And I tried to embody that a little bit in my work. And this is another very recent picture I just painted. I've actually finished that just the week before St. Patrick's Day. This is St. Patrick welcoming the snakes. And I borrowed there's a souvenir shop just down the road from me in Arklow, and they have a big statue of St. Patrick, which I asked to borrow. And they're very religious, they're very sort of traditionally devotional, and they're like, "Oh, be good to St. Patrick now." But I thought, the mythology around St. Patrick is maybe it's time to update it, and particularly my daughter had a snake, and the snake escaped. Snakes are great escape artists. you know. And the snake ended up living in our garden for almost a year before I found it again and rehoused it, rehomed it. But when I rehomed it, you know, sort of, okay, we can't look after the snake anymore. My daughter's not really interested. So I brought it to the pet shop and said, would anyone like this? And she found someone. And I told her the story, and she said, yeah, Ireland's full of snakes. The snakes are actually, there are lots of escaped snakes out there, and a lot of them, they do quite well in the Irish climate, you know. You can get snakes as far north as Norway, you know, naturally speaking. So the snakes are out there, pretty much minding their own business, and if two of a species meet, they'll breed. But you won't see them, you won't find them, in all likelihood, unless you go looking. So the snakes are here, but metaphorically speaking, I think they're also here. And there's a notion, the notion of St. Patrick banishing the snakes was always partly tied up with an Irish identity of purity, you know, that we were pure and insular and different, and we kept, you know, the evils of the big bad world away. And that no longer ties with any notion of real Irish identity. We're now, you know, Ireland Inc., and we're globalized, and we're the base of all the, you know, the big multinationals, and you know, we're totally connected with the global system and all of the evils that it contains or pertains to. So I thought, well, how do we represent this? And I thought maybe St. Patrick welcoming the snakes would be one way of doing it. And I sort of think of it as partly like a small country. We are a small country. We don't control the world that we live in, and we sort of have to make peace with it, you know. However we do that, there's this question of, you know, what do we do with the multinationals? Do we just let them in and let them dominate our lives, or what we do? There is that sort of element of challenge. But this is why I put St. Patrick with the balloons, with all the logos of the multinational companies that are here, and I put like one of Elon Musk's SpaceX rockets is going up there, and in the sky you've got all this Starlink constellation, just sort of, you know, totally covering the sky overhead, rows and rows of satellites, and then you've got Air Force One, you know, shooting past at the bottom with its monstrous inhabitants. So this is sort of, you know, Ireland in the modern world and the world we live in, and how we deal with it, you know, and how we come to terms with it. An attempt to sort of find a way of embodying that. So this is my studio down in Arklow. This is where I'm based now. It's a very nice studio, and anyone who wants to come down and see my work or anything like that is very welcome. I also host life drawing sessions down there on a regular basis, and there's now a little community of artists that I'm building around myself down there, and that I've sort of been inducted. I've partly been inducted into a sort of local community of artists in Arklow, but I'm also sort of drawing people in who are interested in drawing model, and you know, anyone is welcome to join that. We meet every third Friday at the moment, and it's €30 for a day of life drawing, which is about as cheap as you get, and excellent models. And another sort of element of my sort of community activity, I've been doing portrait marathons, and here's a little video of the last one I did from last September, which got a bit of media coverage, and this also goes into the other aspect of a lot of what I do now, which is the broadcasting of what I do on social media, on YouTube and Instagram and whatever. But here's a little video my last.
Artist Conor Walton is undertaking a 12-hour portrait marathon, painting 18 people and live streaming the process.
Ireland's Culture Night is a nationwide celebration of art and culture, aiming to involve as many people as possible in artistic activities and events. My contribution, a portrait painting marathon, was covered in nationwide media and even got on the 6 o'clock news. Over 12 hours I painted 18 portraits in oils in front of a live audience, and the event was also live streamed. Thanks to the support of Whipto Arts Office, I was able to give the portraits to the sitters. Good gymnastics for a painter, an opportunity to meet lots of people and involve them in what I do, and give back to my local community. Thanks to all my sitters, to everyone who made this possible, and to everyone who watched either in person or online. And if you'd like to see how everything unfolded in real time, please go over to my YouTube channel where everything's recorded. So this is in the new art centre in Arklow that I've been involved with setting up, and there's lots of sort of activity there. Just to So that was a bit of fun, and we had a great night. That was like basically at 10 o'clock at night after 12, 14 hours of painting, and I did 18 portraits over the day, and it was all live, it was all on camera, and also just in front of a live audience, and that sort of thing is a little bit what I can essentially give back to the community, but I'm also trying to give back in different ways. I've got a mentoring program which I'm setting up where young artists can get the chance to work with me and live with me in my sort of house kind of studio in Arklow over an extended period in exchange, basically as a barter system. It's all free. I just ask for help with some of my projects, and they get studio space and a place to live. And in the context of modern education and art college and whatever, which isn't always very satisfactory for the students, it's a different model maybe of learning, which I think can really benefit students. And then my last and most recent project is producing a book, which is here, if you want to have a look at. And I've set up Irish Art Press, which is also potentially able to publish other artists' work. But I think I've found a model way of doing it, which can actually make artists money from their books. Because if you get published by a mainstream publisher, the publisher makes money, the booksellers will make money, but you'll get maybe €2 or €3 royalty from the book, and then you have to buy back your own copies at wholesale price. So it ends up as negative cash flow. So I found a way through getting them printed in China, where if artists want to have work published, there's potentially a way to do it. But anyway, I've produced my own book, which is 300 pages and full of stuff. And since you've all paid to attend here. I'll offer it at a discount. It's usually €70, but anyone who wants to buy a copy from me today can get it for €50. And I also have some drawings and other things to look at if you're interested. So thank you very much for listening. Does anyone have any questions?
I do. That's so interesting. I don't want to block you out, wasn't it? But we have to give it a clap. But to finish, we're dying to have an art centre. Would you believe we don't have one? That's one of our big. We want a little space to have an art centre. Even though the Lexicon is not an art centre. Can you believe it?
Yeah. But the art centre in Arklow, where it's all bottom up, it's all voluntary, it's all like we're just finding a way to do it and make it pay without any serious funding. Essentially, we're getting little bits from here and there, but there's it's all basically bottom up and community based.
Yeah, we'd love one, wouldn't we? That's our big passion here, but we won't go on about that now. We've had your talk. Who'd like to ask a few questions? Anyone here? I saw a hand there somewhere. Yeah.
Don't ask a question, just want to say as part of the audience, you're very inspiring, and I love you're so open to sharing your work and your concepts and just the whole encouragement of the arts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did you go to art college here in Dublin?
Yeah, I went to NCAD.
And what brought you to Italy, Florence, is it?
Well, what brought me there? I found the NCAD experience a bit unsatisfactory, just in terms of like the philosophy at the time tended to be, denigrating of skill, and I wanted to learn skills. I at the time when I was in NCAD, I did a joint honours degree in art history and painting, and after that I went on to do first of all a master's in art history. So I sort of followed the academic line. I thought I would have to teach in order to earn a living, and I thought, well, I'll teach art history. I didn't see myself ever thriving in the NCAD or art college environment, given the politics and the values there. So I thought, well, I'll teach the academics. But that, I ended up a little bit disillusioned about the academics. And then I went, Kerry Clark, who was my tutor in NCAD, he recommended that I study with an American painter, Charles Cecil, in Florence. So I went over and spent 6 months there. But that was, I didn't fit in very well to NCAD, but I didn't fit in very well in the atelier in Florence either, because while I was considered so traditional in NCAD that I was reactionary, like I was like some sort of son of Sean Keating, trying to bring back the bad old ways. But when I went to Florence, I was considered a dangerous modernist, who didn't believe, who's prepared to use photographs, who's prepared to paint with acrylics and all sorts of things, and who didn't believe in this uber traditional reactionary notion of what an artist was. So I tried to take from both sides what I could in terms of taking, skill and craftsmanship, or an understanding of craftsmanship and the philosophy behind it wherever I could, but also trying to be a contemporary artist and not caught up in a world where you're actually trying to make your work look like something that was painted in the 17th century or the 18th century and doesn't belong today and doesn't say anything about today.
The great thing is you learn to scale, and like you say, NCAD, you have to there, you've got to teach yourself. They don't teach you a skill. They just give you desk specs. Whereas I think a lot of artists need more than that. They need to learn the basics. Not that they want to live with the basics, they learn something so they can use part of that when they become artists.
I was in college with you actually.
Yeah.
You were the year ahead of me, and so I remember that culture well. But I think the ordinary students in the college really appreciated your skill. I mean, there was very much that thing of conceptual art, being the flavour of the month. Say like the famous people from my year were like Caroline McCarthy, and that's it, I remember her. But so it was very much about. But your work is just as conceptual and brilliant. It's wonderful to see your work after all the years. I haven't been following your career, but I will now. It's great. And I do think that we might have learned the skills in college but you did learn to question, and you certainly brought that.
Oh yeah, it was a very challenging environment, and I did learn a lot, but it wasn't always what I wanted to learn.
I know.
So that was always the problem. But it was like, certainly I think in the early 90s when I was going through, it was interesting in that you still had some of the old guard there. You had people like Kerry Clark and John Kelly, who had been there for decades and who had a very strong skill base, and you could still either learn things from them or at least get a bit of moral support from them. But there were expressionists, there were abstractionists, there were conceptualists, there were postmodernists, and there was a lot of antagonism between the different staff because they disagreed with each other almost about everything. But it was still vital, and there still was a very strong skill base and links back to older traditions.
Yeah, your work was wonderful.
Thanks.
Is it what you said mentioned acrylics? Did you paint in oil? You paint in oil as well?
Oh, at this point I paint. I'm almost entirely an oil painter.
That's what I thought,
and I'm sort of a fundamentalist oil painter to the extent that the vast majority of the paint I use I make myself, and I'm very materials orientated in terms of my own practice. So it's very much from the ground up, but it's sort of, I think of it as scientific in the sense that it's not bound by an outdated notion of the skills. I will use modern materials if they will help me, and I will use modern technology if it helps me, whether CGI, AI, photography, or social media or video or whatever, I will use it because it's available.
I know the module that I did, you were teaching that you were bringing in you were tubing up your own paint and so on and mixing your own. It was really, obviously your knowledge and teaching of colour was quite amazing, and the paint, I couldn't begin to explain it, I'm afraid, but I remember it so well, and I know the notebook when I did the course, but it was quite amazing. I noticed the close-ups there, the textures are almost like there's something in the paint, on a few of those close-ups there. You're painting wet on wet. There's, what do I say? It's not 2D, but the relief. There's a lot of.
Yeah, well,
really beautiful.
I make my paint. I tend to think modern tube paint totally overground. It's just become. It's like Brennan's bread. Like the flour. So the flour is being ground so finely that it no longer has body anymore. So I'm trying to produce a paint that's a bit like a wholemeal brown bread, and that has a bit of structure and a bit of resistance to it, and that's just much more interesting than it's just more interesting as a material than the vast majority of what you get out of the tube these days. So that's why I make my paint. It's not because the color is different. It's to get a larger particle size, and to have something that has character, that hasn't been homogenized and reduced to something so smooth and industrial. It's like modern paint is a product of an industrial process, And modern pigments are not, they're designed to come out of aerosols. You know, that is what most paint is made for these days. It's made to be sprayed. And the market for traditional oil painting is very small relative to the industrial market. So we get what has been produced largely for the industrial market, and the particles are just so fine. It produces this sort of bodiless paint. So that's why I make my own paint, and I try to bulk it up. And I don't grind the paint the traditional way. I just mix it with oil.
Oh, it really shows, doesn't it?
Sorry.
Conor, occasionally you use CGI, as you alluded to, and you're obviously quite a whiz at it. And did you study or did you teach yourself? I mean,
no, I just tried the software, and the software is it's very easy to use. You know, it's like it's made to be used. Any of these software packages, it's like use me.
Photoshop, is it?
No, there are different programs that you can use, but most of them, like, they take a bit of work at the beginning, but they're very user friendly. They're designed to be used, and a lot of them are, they're used by animators and all sorts of people. Like, you can make a movie on a laptop these days, and it's very, very user friendly. So most of my process is still very traditional. I've just dipped into this to try some things, and it does take a lot of time in a way, but it's a different sort of time. When I work directly with the model and I'm paying the model, you know, I have to work fast because you run out the bills pretty quickly if you're working with a live model. So you make decisions quickly. When I'm working with the software, you have so many options, and it's like, well, what happens if I move the arm slightly this way? You know, you can play with it for so long and finesse things for so long that you can end up using time in a different way, and it also uses a lot of processing power. I suppose that's the thing. You know, when I with my last laptop, I'd set it to generate an image, and it might take half an hour to make the image. You have to go off and make a cup of tea and come back and whatever. And I got a new laptop recently, and it was like, bam, you know. And it's a different type of technology. It's the new chips which were developed for gaming, essentially. The new NVIDIA chips, which are behind all the AI now. Which are built for gaming. They're designed for generating images in a very fast way. So now they just go bam, it's there, and you can move on much more quickly. But it allows you to finesse things in a different way, or to play and explore options in a different way.
You're obviously, though, very proficient with this technology, because I'm just scouting around it, and I find it's quite a steep learning curve. Well, you're obviously brighter.
It's going to change. Like, I find it very, it's tedious and painful to try to manipulate a 3D form on a 2D screen. And then I came across someone in California who teaches this, and he developed a way of doing it with goggles. Like, you put on the 3D goggles, so you can walk around and manipulate the thing as if you are in the computer space. Now, I can't do that. He hacked the system to do that. But that is where it's going, and that is what, like, if you've ever seen the, let's say the making of The Hobbit or something like that, where it shows how they use the CGI, and you had the director, literally, like, with goggles on, walking through the space that he was, the digital space that he was filming. it's, you know, what that technology is able to do is incredible. It's being used in cinema and television all the time. It's standard now that they do this, and I don't see any reason why painters can't use it too. But it depends how you conceive of what you do. A lot of people are very hostile to AI. You know, and it's like, you know, the AI is like a threat, you know, because it can generate images so easily, and it can, you know, obviously you've got the AI slop, and it just threatens to submerge us all in a torrent of you know, computer generated imagery. But it can be used to do interesting things.
Well, I think you're dead right. I concur.
Just a minute
A
left.
camera obscura was technology, you know, and arguably a pencil is technology.
Yeah. So
That's it. Our time is up. I'm sure you're exhausted. You've gone well over your time. 20 to 1.
well,
Thank you very much.
thank you.